So in the app ecosystem, there's traditionally kind of two key verticals, gaming being one, non-gaming or subscription being the other. The gaming folks are typically pretty well resourced when it comes to BI and data science, but in the non-gaming side, it's lacking. So that's really where we've seen the opportunity. One observation that I've seen even for some of the bigger folks, they're still having this fallout with iOS. We still see people very heavily reliant on Scan, but we see tools like Meta and so on that are coming up with alternative measurements. And there's a lot of really exciting things that we would talk about of what's really possible with data science and machine learning. How good can we get signals that are feeding these black box algorithms through predictions?
Welcome to How I Grew This, where we dive into the world of digital marketing and connect with leaders in the space about how they're scaling, evolving, and growing.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, we're going to talk through some of the challenges subscription apps face and advice they can use to grow their mobile app. And Amanda and I thought no one better to invite than Shumel Lais. We both know Shumel from his time advising Branch a couple years ago. And thank you for joining us, Shumel. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Good to have you on. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about how you first got into mobile growth and performance marketing?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in performance marketing since pretty while now, about 2010. So this is going before, an MMP existed or tracking existed. The app's always just starting to get popular, and started at an agency called Fetch, which was one of the first kind of mobile agencies at the time. And then moved on to another agency called M&C Saatchi Mobile, again, helping with growth and again, watching how some of the platforms were evolving to adopt and become more mobile first over time, like Meta and so on. And then I went on to start a ad analytics platform called AppSumo. And that was really to overcome some of the challenges we saw in the agency world of combining data and reporting together to make decisions. So yeah, that's how I first entered into mobile. So yeah, it feels like a pretty long time now.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've seen some things. So I love that you kind of saw some challenges from your experience and literally built something to solve it. What kind of made you realize that something like AppSumo needed to exist?
Yes, I think at the time we were very reliant on analyzing data in spreadsheets. Back then there was a lot more fragmentation of ad channels. So it was, manually going into different ad platforms, downloading them one by one in terms of the performance, tying it up with the revenue data. And that was very time consuming. And what it often led to were people were looking at data maybe once a week. So we thought, there's got to be a better way where marketers who don't want to touch SQL queries and so on can just have the data on demand first thing when they, log into their computer. And that's ultimately what we became. So yeah, and that business was again very app focused, almost exclusively working with app businesses that were, I'd say, on the kind of larger end in terms of ones that were pretty diverse in terms of channels. So average client at the time at AppSumo, they were spending around $1 million a month on paid ads. So it was pretty cool. We were like processing about $500 million of ad spend annually. So we had a good visibility on, what were the trends, which ad channels were getting more market share and which ones were changing. And yeah, witnessing kind of towards the tail end of it, Scan and ATT came into it. So yeah, it was a pretty cool journey.
Yeah, trends all around. And obviously now things are getting even crazier. So what are you up to now? What have you been doing since that?
Yeah, so Sumo went on to get acquired by a DSP in this space called Inmobi. So that's been a few years now. Having finished my time there, I got into a bit of consulting and advising just off the back of it. That's how, we met at Branch.
Wow, we were like, hey, come help us out.
Yes, that was really cool. And a lot of these were kind of like part-time gigs at different companies. So, an MMP like Branch being one of them. The others were actually other consumer subscription apps and helping them with growth. So it was a pretty interesting time because you kind of see it from both perspectives of, from a measurement analytics perspective, but also, the end marketer, how are they going about making decisions as well. So that's kind of been the last year and a half. And a couple of months ago, I guess I've kind of got that startup itch to kind of go back into the world of the technology and going full time back into a new business. And this is where the idea of Day 30 came about. I guess a combination of, as doing this consulting, speaking to a lot of growth teams, still seeing a lot of people really struggling with growth on iOS with things like ATT and Scan, despite it having, been a good few years. It's been around, but the struggles didn't seem to go away. And I guess it also, when I met my co-founder, John, whose background's in data science, which wasn't a world that I've necessarily come from, but spending some time with him allowed me to kind of look at it from like a fresh pair of eyes from a performance marketing lens. And there's a lot of really exciting things that we would talk about of what's really possible with data science and machine learning, and where we've seen like the application of it maybe behind from a marketing perspective, or marketing teams aren't equipped with it. So that's really what Day 30 is. It's a hybrid of providing consultancy to subscription app businesses, while we're also looking at some tech in the prediction space as well.
Yeah. I mean, definitely the nature of this industry ever changing. But what I'm hearing as a theme is you kind of getting in, speaking with a lot of companies and really uncovering these challenges that continue to exist, and figuring out how to solve that with what it seems like is a strength in data science, and kind of bringing things to the forefront for folks. So you said you're still kind of working with apps today. What kinds of companies are you working with mostly now?
We've kind of made a choice to go pretty exclusively on subscription apps. So these consumer subscription apps that are selling digital products and services using, the native app store in-app subscription methods. And one of the reasons, I guess, for that, one is just a lesson learned from running a business in the past, and having like a really narrow ICP at the start has been really helpful, and something that, in hindsight, in the last business, I wish we did sooner. And then the other is where we see it's somewhat underserved. So in the app ecosystem, there's traditionally kind of two key verticals, gaming being one, non-gaming or subscription being the other. And I think what we've seen is the gaming folks are typically pretty well-resourced when it comes to BI and data science. But in the non-gaming side, it's lacking. So that's really where we've seen the opportunity. And also just the funnel is also a little bit more linear as well. So there's some interesting opportunities there.
Well, I want to double click on that for a second, Shumel. If I'm starting a subscription app, what are kind of the things I need to get in order to be able to get that going? So like, pretend like you're telling someone, at dinner that is starting an app. What do they need to figure out how to get started?
Yes, I'd say early on, let's assume, you've got your idea or your offer, you've built an app, providing some kind of subscription service. The conversation I have with a lot of really early stage folks, and these are folks that are just starting out, maybe have spent some money on growth or paid user acquisition, or even kind of pre that side of things as well. And the first thing is always around getting your analytics and tracking and events in order. So that's kind of the first piece. So the more behavioral data that you can track early on, the better it's going to be to uncover trends as well. So I think that's usually the first thing in helping people get set up with the right events of tags. So if you think of being able to see like a full funnel of how a user goes from opening the app all the way to how they interact in terms of registering and actually engaging a bit using the app. So that's one aspect, but then being able to split that into how that differs if they're coming on different plans. For example, someone who's on like a weekly subscription plan will behave quite differently to someone who's on an annual plan, as an example. So that's usually my first advice, is just ensuring we've got as much visibility on what's happening. And then the other one is starting to think a little bit about unit economics as well. And that's one thing I've found with really early stage folks. And some of this is down to like how constrained cash flow could be if it's a business who's just gone, a new business, but that's just about to raise some funding, or maybe they don't have that kind of cash flow to fund. And just understanding this concept of like payback period, CAC and LTV, like these are all pretty fundamental metrics to be aware of. And what we find typically with the really early stage folks is they looking to kind of recoup their investment almost immediately, which makes sense if they're, a bit more cash constrained, but then they're kind of comparing themselves to the much bigger apps in the ecosystem. And the way they're able to grow so quickly is they're willing to accept that, okay, it's going to take us 6 months to recoup our investment on user acquisition. So I think it's just understanding those aspects and kind of modeling out what growth looks like and being realistic about how you'd go about that. So those are a couple of things I would say. And maybe the third piece is, there's a notion of like, in an ideal world, you'd have the perfect funnel and you'd have, all your conversion rates optimized. But that's where it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where, you need some initial data to form your benchmarks. So that's where sometimes, just depending on your app, just getting some traffic through, sometimes paid is the quickest, but it is also expensive. So depending on your situation, but just trying to get enough users in on a consistent basis then allows you to do that optimization on tweaking the funnel and so on.
That was a lot. Let me read it back to you. Tell me what I've missed. Get it so you can get analytics you could measure, patience in your ROI, and then you have to have data in order to be able to optimize, is kind of what you said?
Yeah, I'd say the third one is, data in order to optimize. So I almost frame it as traffic.
Get traffic.
So having enough new users coming through so you can test how they're behaving as they go through the different journeys or every test that you make.
I'm just wondering, for any novices in the crowd, like, what is the piece of this learning curve that is most challenging, or like, is there any kind of shortcut that you can offer up for people that are a little overwhelmed by that?
Yeah, I think, there's definitely a lot of resources available. And I think one of the things that I've really noticed, like having started my last business in 2015 and coming back to starting something now, there's a lot of like knowledge sharing within the app ecosystem. Like people are really up for sharing a lot of tactics and strategies, which I don't remember it being like this 10 years ago. So that's kind of the first thing. There's, a number of great contributors in the space that are sharing different tactics on this. So that's something just to be aware of. I guess in terms of shortcuts, a lot of depending on the tool that you use, let's say tracking as an example, a lot of them will come with a lot of standard events tagged that they tag, or some of the tools now have features to auto tag. So you're not having to individually go one by one and select every single event that a user's doing, that they would go and just automatically tag that. So it's almost the first thing is just like get a tracking solution in place. And I'm not even talking about and I guess, we can touch on that as well. This is just getting, grassroots behavioral analytics in to be able to know how users are interacting. So that could be...
You can't improve what you can't measure.
Yeah, in short.
Speaking of in short, what are kind of like, you touched on this when you're saying don't compare yourself against the big apps. For the small apps just starting, what are some of the things you see them doing wrong?
Yeah, so I think where I see them going wrong again is maybe not tagging all these events. That's definitely kind of one aspect of it. Have they got that visibility in place? And then I think, again, it comes back to, which we maybe touched on earlier, which is just this getting comfortable with this payback period, at least in that kind of really early phase. Sometimes in this early phase, people are looking for like results immediately, and that can really like hinder growth. So you may be able to, be ROI positive if you're spending 5K a month on paid ads, but as soon as you get to 10K, it's really hard to scale because you're trying to recoup that investment as quickly as possible. So you kind of wear out those low hanging fruits. So I think that's kind of the key areas when I speak to, consult with, audit a lot of apps set up at the moment as well. And that's quite a common theme and trend that I've seen.
This is probably a novice question, but you just suggested that the payback period between 5K versus 10K is different. Are you saying that your payback period extends the more you spend? That's common?
Yeah, there's ultimately like a diseconomies of scale where, the more you're trying to spend, and 5K is like a really early example, like, that's more on the smaller end when it comes to paid user acquisition. So it's maybe a bit easier to work your way towards profitability, but it's as you start widening the net, you've maybe, gone through those really low hanging fruit really quickly. And it's just natural, I think, for every business, there's always like diminishing returns as you scale.
So you're saying that like you're going to get the best customers first, and then your payback period is higher.
That when you're initially going after those initial customers, so if you think of a platform like, let's take Meta as an example, the way it works is, you set a budget and you set a target or you set a goal. So you might say, get me users who starting trials. And if you think of a pie, and in the middle are like the people that have the highest probability to convert, if your budget's really small, then it can start right in that middle. But as your budget increases, it has to widen in the middle of that pie. So you're going more to people that may not be as confident in converting. And that's ultimately a spectrum. So, again, take the 5K as an example. But the answer in general is, the more you're scaling, the harder it gets.
Does that make your LTV of per user lower as well? Or is that why it takes longer? Or is it because it just takes...
I think it's maybe less of the LTV is lower. It's probably more the cost of acquiring a user. I think it's that...
Goes up?
Yeah, the cost goes up. As you scale, the cost will go up.
I see. Okay. And you mentioned timeframe, a couple of your ROI timeframes a couple of times. For someone who's just starting, what is a realistic timeframe for recouping your ad spend?
Again, I think it's down to the individual business, like how much cash flow do they have? So, a good example is I was consulting with one up and giving them some advice. They wanted to recoup, almost 100% of their investment within 45 days, which again is doable. But what they found was
hard.
Yeah, up to a certain point it worked, and they could, target some, tier 2, tier 3 countries and so on. But anytime they tried to increase their budget or go a bit higher, then that payback period would reduce. And the discussion with them was almost like, if you have the ability to look further and you're able to recoup that money, take a little bit longer to recoup that money, and that's where financing and things come into play. That's where you can then again be willing to pay more per user because you're willing to wait a bit longer. So that's where it comes back to scale and the cost of acquiring a user.
So you said 45 days there for that example, but I got to imagine that's really short compared to most subscription apps.
Yeah. And again, I'd say the ones that are like scaling like heavily, they're willing to wait 6 to 12 months to recoup their money because, they know some of these users may stay longer, up to a year, 2 years and longer. And again, it comes back to the kind of the funding market as well. I think what I've seen is there's definitely more...
Whether you have the cash to wait.
Yeah, whether you have the cash. And then what we're also seeing is even like VCs are now entering this space of growth funding, which is kind of, it's something that's been around for a while, but the number of VCs entering that space has been really interesting because they're just seeing, if a business can prove its unit economics, it's almost like invoice discounting. They're willing to lend against future growth. So that's another way that companies, an alternative route to funding that we're seeing.
So not to press you too hard on this, but I know that the people listening who are just getting started would be like, what should I be shooting for? It's like, so dog food delivery app, something completely random. What should I shoot for ROI on my ad dollar?
I think the answer is, how much runway and cash do you have? So what I've seen...
How long can you afford to wait is the answer.
Yeah. How long can you afford to wait? And what I've seen some really smart folks, like small indie teams that are doing it in a really smart way where they're trying to keep it really constrained. So they are aiming to be, ROI positive pretty quickly. But then what they do is they reinvest that excess that comes delayed into growing. So they're able to over time really grow their user acquisition budget. And they're just taking slightly longer to get there. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable approach. But it's just, I think everyone being comfortable with knowing that, okay, this other competitor may be willing to wait longer.
Okay, we've been talking about small apps. Let's shift completely the opposite of the spectrum and go big apps. First of all, if you had to bifurcate between scaled UA or scaled subscription apps growth versus kind of startup, what would that number be? And well, first of all, what would that metric be? Would it be spend? Would it be earnings? Where would that be? And what is that number?
So we used to do these benchmark reports a while ago in my last business, and we used to categorize companies into kind of these small, medium, and large. So I'd almost say, and this is so subjective depending on which part of the world you're in and so on, but anything less than 20K a month of ad spend, I would say you're much more on the smaller end, indie developer. Again, very feasible to get profitable in that space. Anything up to then, I would say kind of mid 6 digits. So up to 400, 500K, I'd say is like
spend.
Small,
500K spend
a month. Yeah, it's still, and maybe, I might be a bit biased because of my historical context is looking at slightly larger apps. But I'd say I'd consider them still in the kind of mid-tier, mid-market
That
in
is
terms
wild.
of spend. But it's only because then you see what's on the other end. The folks that have really cracked it, they are easily spending, $500,000 and above, $1 million a month on paid UA, and they can do that with, a handful of channels if they can really,
That's
their product's good and they've got their user acquisition on point. So yeah, for me, if I was to say, when we talk about more established, larger subscription apps, I would say those spending $500,000 plus a month on paid user acquisition.
I'm just curious because, everyone's talking about how they think these days just like the mobile advertising economy is going to continue to grow. Do you foresee that like with the new tools and new advancements that that's primarily going to come from this top category, like that they're the only ones that are really going to increase? Or do you think these new shifts and trends are also going to impact the smaller guys?
I think it's going to come from the smaller guys as well. And mainly because the development of an app has just become, the barriers to create an app now, especially a subscription app, has just reduced so much with the help of AI. The amount of like AI apps that are coming out, which are in essence, wrappers or using APIs of some of the existing, larger AI companies out there. There's another one that I've been speaking to recently who are ultimately like a photo editing app. And, these companies are ultimately using these, enterprise APIs from some of the larger players in the space, repackaging it into a really, user-friendly, consumer-focused, very specific use case, able to charge, weekly subscriptions on it. Some of these are like fairly low ticket, but it also means like
Weekly.
Weekly subscriptions is another really interesting one.
I mean, I've done it. I've literally bought one of these before.
Yeah, like these kind of AI professional headshots, AI celebrity lookalikes. There's so many of these things, but they can, build these products pretty quickly. So I just see more and more of that like really exploding. And I think I've seen the last stat, I can't remember if it was from Sensor Tower, but subscription apps is like where there's really a lot of growth coming. I think it's around 30% year over year last year. So out of all the verticals, I think people are finding, everyone likes repeatable and predictable revenue, right? And it's just like something that can work really well if you can nail your unit economics.
We can get into AI in a minute, but I want to pause on the big apps for a second, because the small apps, we were talking a lot about how a lot of their problems, or a lot of how they get started, is just getting their house in order, getting their data together, getting enough scale, getting enough measurements to be able to kind of figure out what's working, what's not, figure out the ROI. It's like figure out your business. With the scaled apps, how has that environment changed? What are the challenges they're running into? Because I assume they've got their house in order, they've got data, they've got tracking, they've got all that kind of taken care of. What are the changes you see at the scaled app ecosystem, and what are the challenges they're seeing?
Yeah. So I'd say, again, if we think of our definition of scaled app as those that are spending, upwards of $500,000 plus as our definition, I think in terms of what's interesting is some of these apps have been very like VC funded. So I'm kind of almost excluding the top 0.1%, your Netflix and your Spotify's of the world. And if I look at everyone outside of that, they're still having this fallout with iOS is what I'm seeing. And we've definitely seen, a lot of shift in the ecosystem and things kind of giving some power back to folks in the iOS space. But I think because it's been such a fallout over the last few years, I think there's still an opportunity for people to leverage some of these new things that are coming out. So, we still see people very heavily reliant on Scan in certain instances, but, we see tools like Meta and so on that are coming up with alternative measurements, which is still privacy preserving, probabilistic, but it does start giving you back some confidence in longer term outlook. So I think that's one observation that I've seen even for some of the bigger folks.
Just for some background of folks who are listening, you're mentioning the anti-steering judgment where Apple has to open up the App Store subscription payment mechanism to third parties. So Stripe famously has released a very slick API that allows you to purchase around App Store. And that's a 30% cut for these people making above $1 million a year. So that I was going to ask, that's a big focus for them. That's a big change for them, 30%, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's been really interesting. There's a lot of interesting paywall businesses or tools that have popped up, as well as these web to app funnel products as well. And they've all kind of, I think, existed to kind of work their way around App Store taxes or better attribution. But definitely, I think with this announcement or this decision on Apple having to open it up, what's been interesting, I think the initial reaction from everyone was like, this is brilliant, we're all saving, getting 30% richer. The reality was quite far from it. And there has been some interesting studies that showed the thing that you need to take into consideration is like the drop off. There's a level of trust that comes in with the native payments as well. And what some of the early results showed from these companies, I know RevenueCat was one of them that did a really interesting study on it, was that it didn't make that much sense for the smaller apps that were maybe only getting the 15% commission. And even those that were paying 30% commission, if you were a smaller app, a less known app, but getting charged 30%, your conversion rate was still dropping. So I think the real winners in this whole app store opening up and taxes is the really big players, the ones that have really a lot of brand recognition. I think, the Netflixes, the Spotifys, the even someone like Match and Tinder and those folks that have been established for a while. If someone's subscribing to those products and they've gone to that product knowing exactly who the brand is, I don't think they're too concerned about checking out of the app store to go pay on the web. So that's kind of been the initial result so far. And it'll be interesting to see how, Apple comes back, maybe not again trying to overturn the decision, but how they continue to add value to developers. So there's more incentive for them to stay with using their own checkout.
All right. I think I want to get back into AI for a second. I know we brought it up and how it's making it easier for folks to launch new apps today. How are you seeing teams use AI from building to growth workflows? What's something you've seen, want to share?
Yeah, definitely. So I think creative's been like the biggest area that I've seen everyone dabble in. And I say dabble in because I think everyone's testing and trying tools, but there's a concept when you're running meta ads where you talk about winners, and you may hear this term like winning creative. And the way meta works in, nowadays, it's really, you throw as much creative at the wall and you see what sticks in essence. It's become this real topic of volume and variety as well. So that's where AI has been really interesting to just accelerate that, because now it's just so much easier to do multiple variations. You can prompt videos, AI generated UGC characters. So that's where we've seen, a lot of growth. I don't know yet in terms of how much that always translates to those winners. And I think that's kind of the next piece that will show it's definitely speeding things up. How many of those winning creatives are really AI generated? But it's going to get there. It's only getting better and better.
Quick question, Shumel. When you say creative, you're talking about advertising creative right there, right? To drive people to download the app. One of the things that I find so fascinating about subscriptions is the actual paywall is as important, sometimes more important than getting them into the app, is like getting them to subscribe. Are people using AI and doing A/B tests to use the actual paywall?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of paywall tools, like paywall optimization is such a big aspect. Again, there's been a number of benchmark studies, and even in our own analysis, when we onboard a customer, we look at, how long it takes someone to do certain behaviors. So, someone who starts a subscription, for example, we've seen very commonly, 90% of people who ever start a subscription are going to do so within the first hour or the first few minutes. So that paywall is just such a key aspect of it. However, what I do find is, this paywall tools, I think are going to converge over time. It's going to become a bit more commoditized because already everyone's sharing kind of best practices. There's tools that will auto generate these paywalls for you. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how that evolves. But I think it's just becoming table stakes now for every subscription app to make sure they've, got the right tools in place to test different paywalls. Is it a hard paywall? Is it a soft paywall that allows you to close all the different plans and packages and placements of it? And there's definitely best practices that you end up seeing.
So I feel like the world itself is getting more complicated, but it's almost like because it is, people are sharing more and they've learned more, and there's these new technologies and new systems that really do make it easier for people to kind of make their way through and obviously lean on, advisors and all sorts of things. But I guess that's kind of what I'm taking away. But I also want to hear just what is your growth advice for subscription apps generally?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to really making the most of the data that's available. I think ultimately, the proof is in the numbers. So making sure you've got your data and your house in order. Again, like right now, there's this concept where platforms are becoming so algorithmic, and you'll hear a term of like creative is king. Again, at the same time, these ad platforms are still limited to just the kind of data or the visibility of what a user's doing within their platform. And that's typically limited to about 7 days. If I think of something like Facebook, they'll optimize to what's happening in 7 days. But we know the real value that the business cares about is much longer. And we talk about terms like lifetime value, right? What is a user worth over 12 months or so on? So I think having your data in order, being really comfortable with those metrics is just helps give everyone confidence of how you can scale.
I have kind of a random question, just a dumb question. We've talked a lot about data. We've talked a lot about ROI. I've talked a lot about the science behind it, the math. How important is the actual app itself? Could it be a piece of crap? Like, does it have to be a good app?
Yeah, really good question. And again, it comes back down to what payback period do you want, right? There's certain apps that can be so like tactical and transactional where, they're comfortable knowing that people are going to subscribe for 1 to 2 weeks and then cancel, but maybe they're able to just acquire those users so efficiently. So it's interesting. It's almost like the hyper casual in gaming. Does that hyper casual subscription end up happening as well?
So the crappier your app, the faster you have to have a payback period. And the better your app, the longer you can wait because you're going to stick around.
So don't give up on your amazing idea, people.
Yeah, and when you say payback period, you might be never, really.
Think of all the lives you will have improved. Okay, that kind of reminds me. I mean, I have a friend going through this right now, solo founder launching a subscription app. What advice is for them? And we talked a lot about the data and all of this. Like, when do you start to run paid acquisition? Like, when does that come into play? Let's take a step back.
Yeah, I think paid just gives you like instant feedback. I think that's the way to think about it. And I don't think the advice is, especially for solo founders, like go and spend, 5K on paid ads tomorrow. But it's just a really cool way to get feedback. And even on your things like your value proposition and your messaging as well. So seeing really like what's resonating, are there specific jobs that the user's trying to do that resonates better? Is there specific features in the app that resonates better? Or even also kind of like what's the pain point that it gets the most interaction? So I think that's where advertising just gives you that quick feedback, and those things can be translated into the app, not just for ad creative, but also just onboarding users and how you position your product.
Right. So which is why the data is so important. So you can actually see the feedback of like who is dropping off, who is completing X, Y, and Z. That makes a lot of sense. All right. So what are you most excited to figure out at day 30 in the next 6 months to a year?
Yeah, so we're pretty early on in our journey where, a few months into this, I've just been really impressed with like what's possible with data science to solve some of these privacy challenges and, unlocking those kind of further funnel events. So for us, really over the next 6 to 12 months, I'm really interested to see, how good can we get signals that are feeding these black box algorithms through predictions. And every week speaking to new advertisers, learning from every conversation that I have. And you start to see, certain trends and things emerge as well. Really excited of what the rest of the year looks like.
Sounds awesome. Well, Adam, any final questions for our wonderful guest here?
I mean, to be honest, yes, I could probably bend his ear for another hour. But we're already over time. And so maybe we'll have you back in 6 months to see how your journey is going, see how the end of the year is going.
Yeah.
And ask you all the other questions that we'll have in the meantime.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for having me, folks.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for coming.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, please leave a review wherever you listen to this and share with someone trying to grow their career or their business. Until next time, keep growing.